Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Michael Norton, who is a professor at Harvard Business School, runs a thing called the Nerd Lab, and is also the author of this recent book called The Ritual Effect, From Habit to Ritual, Harness the Surprising Power of Everyday Actions. Also the co-author of Happy Money, The Science of Smarter Spending. Welcome, Mike.
Thanks so much for having me.
So you wrote a whole book on ritual, and I know a lot of people are wondering, well, what's ritual? A whole bunch of other people are like, well, yeah, duh, like we all know about ritual. But I feel like ritual has been the domain of anthropologists, right? So anybody who's read Clifford Geertz or, Malinowski or, any of those folks, They know that, ritual is extremely important, but that it's really about meaning. And psychologists, until fairly recently, meaning wasn't their business, right? I mean, behavior is their business, maybe decision-making is their business, but meaning is a little too tricky. And you talk a little bit in the book about how, you realized that this was something that you could study as a social psychologist. It's not, and one would think that you can't do RCTs on this and interventions, but you actually have designed quite a few ways of like creating rituals and so forth. So I want to ask you about that. And then I guess the other thing I really want to ask about is you refer to Weber and the disenchantment of the world. And I think maybe one of the reasons why we think that ritual is the domain of anthropologists is because anthropologists study that old world, the enchanted world that we no longer live in. And I guess I wanted to find out from you whether or not you think that Weber was right, that we do live in a world that is disenchanted and devoid of ritual, or have the rituals just morphed, from what you call legacy rituals to these, different kinds of rituals, maybe ones that aren't quite as agreed upon and shared, and that aren't quite as institutional, maybe a little bit more private. So I guess I threw too many questions at you right at the outset, but
I like them all.
Yeah, but I guess maybe start by not only talking about how did psychology come to realize that this was something that was within its domain, and then personally, you yourself, how did you kind of come to this realization and realize that this is something you could work on?
When I first started studying rituals, I actually thought I was going to study the legacy kind. In other words, I thought I was going to look at they often come from faith or from culture or from family as well. And what I wanted to do was understand what they're doing for us. That kind, actually. We kind of know what they're doing. If we have birthday parties, we know what they're doing for us. But I really wanted to dive into why does every culture have something around birthdays? What is it doing for us? And we did some of that research, actually. But the thing that kind of came out of the research that I wasn't necessarily expecting was all the ones that people came up with themselves. And there are so many in so many domains of life where people would tell us, yes, I do that kind, I do the official kind. And something, I also do this other little thing by myself, or my family does this idiosyncratic thing that we came up with. And that really started, and there's so many great examples, but that really started opening it up in a different way, because if the only rituals that quote unquote work have to be, let's say if it's not 1,000 years old, it doesn't work. Imagine, that were the case. Well, then we could only study the 1,000-year-old rituals. But if we can see that even ones that people come up with themselves today can have an impact, that opens it up much more, because now we can say, well, what are all the new rituals that people are coming up with? And a little bit we can say, why don't you try coming up with your own? Actually, if we can show that these kind that are brand new have some resonance, maybe not as much as the 1,000-year-old ritual. I don't mean to discount those in any way. They're so important in our lives. But opening up the whole area of research for me really was to say, what actually are people doing in their everyday lives, not just on these very important occasions?
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess we need to distinguish ritual from these other things like habits and compulsions. And sometimes as you describe these rituals, some of them sound a lot like habits, and others sound awful lot like compulsions, right? So particularly when you talk about the the behavior of some of these athletes and the complex ticks that they go through to ensure good luck. I mean, it starts to veer into OCD territory right after a while. So how do we distinguish between these three categories?
I think I'm glad you asked, because this is not a book that's like add more rituals, add as many as you can, and then you'll be happy. That is absolutely not the message of the book at all. It's understanding the role that they play in our lives, because, as you said, they don't only do good things for us, they also can lead to problematic behavior. And we do see with athletes, for example, especially very high performing athletes or musicians or singers or whatever, almost all of them have something they do before they have to do their thing. And they're very elaborate sometimes. So Serena Williams with her serve, Rafael Nadal with his serve, they do one thing. Rafael Nadal does, he picks his wedgie before he serves every single time. And there's the wiping and the racket and all this stuff. And so at some point you can say, has he gone too far with that? And if you think about going from a ritual that might be helpful to something that's a compulsion, one of the ways that clinical psychologists think about it is the ritual interfering with your other goals in life? Is it preventing you from doing the thing that you really wanted to do? So maybe not the best example, but if Nadal kept picking his wedgie the entire match, he would lose 6-0, 6-0, 6-0. And we would say, the ritual has gone too far for him. He needs to pull it back to have a time and place to do it in order to then do the other thing that he wanted to do. So there you see, too much can start to get in the way of things. So more isn't necessarily better. It's having them at the right moment with the right amount of time that people say, now I feel good about it.
Well, I mean, rituals do a lot of different things. And I think, the idea of an emotion generator is one of them, or sometimes an emotion suppressor is another one. But in these specific examples, right, of the athletes and so forth, I mean, I think there it kind of goes back to and I was talking to Dan Ariely about this the other day. This, and the anthropologist studied this, when it's not really clear. There's some causal ambiguity, right? And you don't really know what causes what. I mean, we notice even children, if they see someone engage in some activity that leads to a successful outcome, they'll just copy that activity without having any kind of folk physics about the connection. So these types of, some people would call it like, I don't know, magical thinking. I mean, but these kinds of behaviors, is there any evidence of decay, right? I mean, are we Bayesians? Like, do we learn? I mean, we don't really test these things experimentally, but if you keep doing this stuff and you don't get the success, do we say, oh, well, maybe I should stop doing it, or maybe I should try it in a different way? It seems like all they do, they just keep accumulating, but they never get kind of purged or cleaned out of the system.
It's interesting. So talking to athletes, for example, across all sports, I can't say all of them, of course, but many of them have these kinds of rituals, and they feel about them as though that's their ritual. I always do this. But if I say, did you do the exact same thing 5 years ago? They say, well, no, not exactly. And I say, oh, well, how did it change? And they say, well, I used to bounce it twice and now I bounce it 3 times. Or I used to do this and now I do this instead. And so they feel to us often as though they're fixed and rigid. But in fact, even in our own lives, we're changing them all the time. And the reason I say that is because if they stop working for you, you could say rituals obviously don't work, I'm never doing them again. Or you can say, I must have the wrong ritual. It seems what people are likely to do is say, I must have the wrong ritual. Let me mix it up a little bit and see if that will help. And it really, to me, it speaks to how deeply ingrained they are in us, because we are, in a sense, ignoring evidence from the world that not all of them work. And we continue to do them and modify them and shape them as though if we keep doing that, we'll get to the optimal one.
Yeah, and you talk about it as sort of a stress regulation tool. I didn't know this about Sviatoslav Richter. I mean, he's one of my favorite pianists, and I did not know about the lobster, right, that he brings with him. But I mean, why does it work, though? I mean, what's the sort of evolutionary rationale for this this tool to work. I mean, I did another podcast where we talked about how alcohol can serve as a PFC downregulator, right? To alleviate, the stuff that's going on in the brain. And some of the rituals actually you talk about in the book have to do with transitioning out of work and into the home. And I think part of that also has to do with kind of PFC downregulation. But, why, it's obvious why alcohol works. It's obvious how beta blockers work.
Yeah.
But what's the mechanism for, these rituals helping us to downregulate our stress?
Yeah, I think first off, as you said, they're emotion generators. So we use them, bizarrely, we use them to generate a wide array of emotions. So we use them at funerals and at weddings, and we use them to psych ourselves up, and we use them to calm ourselves down. So they're not a thing that if you do a ritual, it produces X. It's if you do a ritual, it can produce all kinds of different emotions, which again makes it, for me, more interesting to study because what's happening. But in the domain of stress in particular, some researchers have shown, so if you think about anxiety, if you have ever had anxiety, which most of us have at some point, one of the things that happens with anxiety is you're worried about the thing that you have to do. It could be serving at Wimbledon. It could be a meeting that's coming up, whatever it might be. And when you're anxious, your thoughts start to kind of spiral a little bit. So you start to get not only anxious about the presentation, but you think, oh my God, that's not going to go well. And then if that doesn't go well, I'm probably going to get fired. And if I get fired, I'm probably going to get divorced. This is the nature of anxiety, is it spirals and spirals. And one of the things that researchers have shown in a sense is that it's not necessarily that rituals can just magically take all of our anxiety away. Of course, that's not how humans work. But if you think of spiraling and you're doing something that's very ordered and regular, that you've been doing for quite some time, it actually just takes up enough resources where you're not spiraling as much. So you're not going to be zen because the thing's still happening. You're still nervous about it. But they've suggested that it kind of crowds out some of the spiraling and at least keeps you focused on the task at hand.
Mm-hmm. Now, I mean, with respect to ritual, it's kind of like habit in the sense that, Aristotle says you should have good habits and not bad habits, but he doesn't say like you should have a life of habits versus a life of non-habits. I mean, there seems to be this notion that, you're going to have habits no matter what. I say, might as well have good ones. Is ritual like that? I mean, is it that, we're going to have rituals kind of no matter what, or is there a sense in which, some people have more and some people have fewer, and culturally, we see like a decrease or an increase in the quantity of, ritual?
Yeah, I think it depends a little bit on what you count as a ritual. So if you see a decline in religious participation, for example, well, then you could say people are not going to religious services, so they've stopped performing that ritual, and therefore we're now on the decline. But if you start to count non-religious things, it's not at all clear that we're on the decline. So something like Burning Man is, if you kind of break it down, it's like-minded people going on a pilgrimage into the desert, which may sound familiar from various ancient texts, going on a pilgrimage into the desert, taking substances that are altering their mind state, let's say, which again is quite common in history. And I mean, literally, there's a totemic figure that is burned at the end of the thing. You couldn't have a more ritualistic. The only thing it's missing is faith. So if you think faith is essential to ritual, then that probably has declined. But if you think actually rituals have all of these elements that are good for us, it's very unclear. We're constantly coming up with new ones to replace the old ones. One of my favorite things we came across was the Seattle Atheist Church. On one level, makes no sense at all, but it makes perfect sense. What are they doing? They're saying, we happen to not have the faith component, but we really like church. It brings us together with people who share our values. It's a place where we can coordinate volunteering in the community. Religious services have all of these benefits for us, even if there's no faith. And so on one hand, you could say, wow, the Seattle Atheist Church is less of a ritual. But from another view, you could say, wow, it's really actually quite ritualistic. They're just not doing it exactly the same way that others are.
Yeah, and I guess if you define faith broadly enough, it's, there's still faith involved. I was just at a former Soviet country and went to visit a Eastern Orthodox church, and they described how, for about 80 years it was a church of the people, so to speak. And we know about the Temple of Reason and the French Revolution and so forth. And so it seems like there's the demand is there, and then it's just a question of how it's going to be supplied. And so you mentioned how like the wellness industry is tapping into that demand for ritual. And if you take vitamins every day, I mean, there's an element of faith that the vitamins are actually doing something for you, in the same way that saying the rosary is going to do something for you, right?
Yeah, it's very hard to tell in the end if the vitamin helped you specifically, right? You're just never going to know. You don't have the experiment where you didn't take it, but we like to believe, if I do this thing every morning, maybe it's going to be good for me. In a similar way that you could think about other kinds of rituals that we enact.
Mm-hmm. Now, you talk about sort of, shared ritual versus private ritual. It seems like there's a whole series of concentric circles of ritual, right? So there's shared rituals with your spouse, shared ritual with the folks at work, shared ritual with the country, whatever, Pledge of Allegiance and so forth. Do we have sort of more ritual circles that we need to navigate now than perhaps we have had in the past? Because of so many different things that we're participating in.
What's interesting for me is the anthropologists and who've studied rituals for a long time. Amazing, fascinating research. But they weren't asking people about their little private ones. It's not that they were focused on. They're anthropologists. And so when I ask people today in 2024, hey, is there anything you do before you're anxious about a presentation? And they say, yeah, you know what I do? It's a confessional. You know what I do actually is I go into the bathroom and look under the stall and make sure nobody's there. And then I say this to myself in the mirror. You know what I mean? It's this element and there's no ancient text that says, obviously, look in the bathroom kind of thing. So we see this kind of, when you approach it at the level of the individual, it seems like a proliferation. But we don't know if they were just as common 100 years ago in other cultures, because that wasn't sort of the unit of analysis. So it's difficult in some sense to count the total number then and now, because we don't quite have all the data that we might want to say, is it just that humans need this much ritual, whatever it is? And it could be collective and religious. It could be something private that they do themselves, but there's some kind of minimum threshold that most of us seem to want to get to in our lives. And I don't know the answer to that question, but that partly drove it, which is where and how much are these playing a role in our lives? And let's explore all these different domains.
Yeah, I'm kind of fascinated by this idea of emotion generator, right? Because I think we have a model of emotion where the emotion is what motivates us to do stuff, right? And so it's like external environment leads to emotion leads to action. But to the extent that we can manipulate our emotions and get us to do action, it sort of becomes this feedback loop, right? And so I guess, the question is, why does it work, right? Is this sort of an example of operant conditioning, right? Where we, associate certain actions with certain emotions or certain environments with certain emotions. And then, so once we discover the correlations, then we can kind of use this as a tool.
Partly, I think that is what's going on. Partly, I think the way that humans are built, unfortunately for us, is that we can't change our emotions when we feel like it. So in other words, it would be amazing if I felt sad, if I could snap and be happy, just automatic, just instantly.
Yeah,
we could easily be built like that.
Now would be a really good time for me to be happy.
Completely.
Boom.
Boom. Or calm or whatever, or in love, you just snap and there it comes.
Well, you talk about these monks, right? Who would have this incredible control. But again, they weren't snapping their fingers.
Right.
Even the ones that have like the most intense amount of emotional regulation, they still use these tools, right? They don't it's not sheer willpower.
That's right. And I think there's something to I'm a social psychologist. So one of the things we think a lot about is we actually look at ourselves to infer how we're doing. Mm-hmm. So if I'm standing around and suddenly I notice that my heart is racing, I might be like, oh, I guess I must be nervous about something. In other words, we look to our body to tell us what's happening, and we're not able to just change things automatically. So sometimes we behave in ways that reflect the emotion that we want to get to. So if I am feeling like we all need to get amped up for this game, let's behave in a manner that is amped up. Let's do it all together and clap at the same time and shout at the same time. And it's almost as though you look around and you say, I guess we're amped up. Look what we just did. But we needed the clapping and the stomping and the shouting to get there as a group, because it shows us, in a sense, collectively, this is where we are. If you think of, we talked about, anxiety and performance, you can't just calm yourself down. It just does not. In fact, if you tell yourself to calm down, it's the worst thing you can possibly do. It just makes you more anxious. But if you do something orderly that you've done every time, and you have everything where you want it and everything, you can see how you're showing yourself, I'm not completely out of control. I can still do my little thing with my coffee cup. So maybe that's evidence to me that I can actually go and do this thing. So for me, partly, it's difficult to show that experimentally or research wise that is the process. But I do think that is part of it, actually, in why we engage in sometimes very random actions, but they start to have this meaning and emotion embedded in them.
So it's like fake it till you make it, right? In a way.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, actually,
because you could also take a beta blocker, as you said. We have things we can do to calm ourselves down that are a little bit more like snapping your finger, but we need to do something to change that state. And sometimes what we turn to is a ritual, and often we turn to something else. But to me, it's so interesting that across domains of life, one of the things that many humans turn to is this tool of ritual to try and help them with whatever they're facing.
Yeah. I mean, Pascal said, if you want to be religious, just go to church and say the prayers and it might kick in. I have a friend who, he's an atheist, and he was in Oxford recently, and he was going to church every day, going to evensong. And I was like, well, if you keep doing this, right, you never know what might happen, right? Are you aware of the possibilities here that might flow from this? But you're known for the work on the IKEA effect, right? And I think everyone knows what this is, but what's the mechanism there? I mean, is it cognitive dissonance, right? I mean, is it that, like, we see ourselves investing effort, and so therefore it must have meaning, right? Is it self-signaling? I mean, I know that when you're doing something for another person, right? If you buy a birthday card that has a note written in it, people don't value it as highly as if you write the note. And now if they find out that you wrote the note with ChatGPT, they get very upset, and they're like, oh, you did not, even though it's a beautiful, well-written thing, it's probably better than anything you could ever write. It's not the result. It's not the actual note that matters. I need to know that you spent time doing this. And so
it's why wrapping paper exists.
Yeah. Right.
Instead of handing things out in a brown paper bag. Yeah.
And so is that the same thing when we're kind of sending a message to ourselves that this is valuable product, valuable output, valuable activity?
There is for sure an element of that effort, exerting effort in something does lead us to infer, I must be really into this thing because I'm a reasonable person. So why would I have exerted all this effort unless the thing was actually valuable? To me, one of the greatest examples is parenthood, actually, where everybody thinks their kids are amazing. Well, maybe that's because they put so much effort in along the way that they have to say, this has to be the best kid in the world. Otherwise, why?
Endowment effect, right? It's just endowment effect. They're your
why
kids.
Did I change all those diapers if this kid isn't amazing? So I think it's very deep in us, actually, that the things we devote effort to are actually valuable to us. Mm-hmm. And it does apply a bit to ritual as well, because when we come up with our own rituals, it's true we can be endowed with those legacy rituals, and they can be incredibly meaningful to us. But we've also got this other thing going on where when we make and create things ourselves, well, then we're putting our own effort into it, and they can come to have a different kind of value than the ones that we're endowed with.
Right. And so the more complicated it is, the more it requires some effort, the more meaningful it might be. I mean, I think you talk about this with groups, right? So if there's a shared ritual and somebody kind of does a poor job of it, right? then we're like, well, what's wrong with that guy? Like, he must not really care about the group, because he's kind of half-assing the ritual, right? So then it becomes a signal of how invested you are in the community.
I can do things if I'm teaching where I can have, or giving a talk or whatever, I can have everybody stand up and I'll put up on the screen a ritual that I made up. That's, clap once, stomp once, yell this thing, put your arm in the air, yell this thing. And first off, when people see that, they start doing it. I don't even have to say get started. They just see it and they start doing it. They sync up with each other very quickly, even though I didn't say sync up with each other. It feels good to all clap at the same time, stomp at the same time, yell at the same time. And as you said, if people opt out, the other people are furious. I mean, actually like mad at the person who's sitting there. And I say, why are you mad at that person? And they say, well, they weren't doing it right. And I say, doing what? How can there be a right way to do this? You've never seen it before and you just did it for the first time. And again, it shows how quickly these things can start to have meaning for us and how quickly they can bond us with people. But also, I think it's important to note how quickly they can separate us from people who do it differently from us. And we looked at that in our research as well. It's not that you do rituals and it's all warm and fuzzy. It's that they can bind us together and they can separate us from other people. So there's a tension. It's like a risk reward kind of relationship with ritual.
Well, we know about those studies where, you assign people randomly into groups, and, you're the blue shirts and you're the red shirts or whatever, the Eagles and the Tomahawks or whatever. But, I think you say that those effects become much stronger when there's a ritual element. So you can actually use ritual to strengthen bonds and also, create divisions. And, companies know this. Companies do this, right? I mean, we used to make fun of the Toyota exercise, and song routine, like, who would want to be that company? Is crazy, right? But successful companies, they leverage ritual, right, to form a sense of belonging and common purpose.
That's right. And very often the rituals that companies have are really intended to reflect a specific value that the company cares about. I was just talking to someone who told me at their company, what they do is every Friday, it's a smallish company, so they have an all hands every Friday, and each group says something that another group did that they're grateful for. Somebody on another team helped me out with this thing I was working on, and they do it every Friday. Now they could do anything. They could say, think of another group that made you laugh this week. Tell us about that. But they don't do laugh. They do gratitude. And they're really trying to show in that moment, one of the things that we care about in this place is helping and gratitude. And you can have a silly mission statement that says, gratitude and all these platitudes, or you can use these kinds of regular rituals to show repeatedly, this is the value that we really care about. And families, when they have rituals at dinner time as well, they're very often communicating a value that they really think is very important.
Now, you're in the marketing group, but do you offer MBA students lessons on, ritual engineering, right? In the HR world, right? In leadership?
For sure. I mean, it's funny because if I talk to companies about ritual, they're often, what they want is one that works. In other words, that I would say to them, turning around 8 times and then clapping 7 times, do that. If you do that exactly, that's going to work in every organization in the world. And we just don't see that. That's really not, it may be the case, but that's really not what we've seen in our research, which is that they're very idiosyncratic. They're very specific to the organization, and they often come from the bottom up instead of from the top down. Sometimes when the top down thing happens, that's when employees do the eye roll. Their manager saw a TED talk over the weekend and then comes in on Monday and says, here's the new management style or whatever it might be. When I talk to companies, I say, what are you already doing that has these features? How do you start meetings? How do you end meetings? How do you start the week? How do you end the week? What do you do at lunchtime? What are the practices that you already have in place? Let's use those as a starting point if we want to design rituals that might bond people together. Or again, different goals, right? You might want to value creativity And so you can design rituals around honoring creativity. They're really quite flexible in the value, but it isn't the case that it's the same ritual does the same thing in every company.
So part of it is about designing rituals and then, pushing them down, but part of it's about sort of identifying rituals that may already be there and then amplifying them or maybe suppressing them if they're harmful ones.
I think that's right. I mean, there's many companies have rituals in place that they're almost like legacy rituals. They were started in the 1980s or something, and the company's still doing them today. But no one at the company was there when they started, so they hate them. They've got nothing to do with anything. They're like, why do we have to do this thing from the 1980s? It's stupid. It's the same ritual that it was in the 1980s. It's just it's lost its meaning. So don't keep making people do that thing because it's not working. It's not reflecting the value that it maybe reflected before. Those are points where you really should think about what are some bottom up things that in the end might have the same effect. It's just the actions themselves come from us instead of from management or from the past.
I think one of the experiments you did is you had people engage in some ritual facing each other versus facing away from each other. And there was a big difference. How much of this is, to the extent that these are, I don't know, physical rituals that involve movement. How much is this sort of tapping into the kind of, mirror neuron phenomenon where, we tend to like people who are like us. And so if we move in unison, we dance and march and so forth, we have a stronger sense of unity.
I think in group rituals, for sure, lots of research for many years has shown synchrony makes us think all kinds of things about other people, including we like them more, we trust them more. And that is, I think, an important element of these group ones, that when we move together, when we're facing each other as opposed to facing away, we're able to synchronize. And that does whether it should or not is a separate question, but it does do something for us. At the same time, we can do rituals in isolation that don't have that component, but still can have an emotional impact. So it's almost as though what we see with rituals is that they're features that increase their potency, but there's very few that are required in order for it to sort of work in that way. It's just that we come up with different kinds in different domains.
And you also talk about rites of passage. I found this, I found this interesting because my high school bled into my college bled into my graduate school, my graduate school bled into my other graduate school. I took some jobs which bled into other jobs, and I've never really done any of these rites of passage, and I just think they were stupid and silly. And then I realized afterwards, oh, these things are very important because they kind of help you to, I don't know, slough off certain things. To what extent is it important that we need to kind of create these artificial discontinuities in our life?
It's super interesting to look both historically, but now as well, the cultures and religions that somewhere between the ages of, let's say, 12 and 16, something happens. People between those ages have to do something. And then after they do that something, they're not kids anymore. They're fully formed members of the community with all the rights and responsibilities that come with being fully formed. The form that takes across cultures is every possible thing you could imagine. You know what I mean? Every rite of passage, culture to culture, is incredibly different. And some of them you memorize a text and say it out loud, and others you're stung by bullet ants. Completely different. And yet what they have in common is we think that there's a point at which we need a demarcation to show you and us that you're not that and you are this. And they often get kind of diluted over time, I think is what I would say. So if people say I've never done a ritual, I say, you ever walk across the stage with a square hat and get a piece of rolled up paper, with a ridiculous robe? And oh yeah, of course I've done that. Well, what are we doing there? We're trying again to say in front of everyone, you are no longer a high school student. Now you are something different. For some of us, it's just annoying, I think, and we kind of reject it. But culturally, I think they're still quite important to demarcate these different phases of our lives.
And it helps us to, it helps us to move on. I mean, you talk about, rites of mourning and rites of forgiveness. And, but I mean, again, I think there's still something of a cognitive mystery as to why we can't just sort of have shades of gray. Like, why do we, I mean, economists are always, we love to think in terms of kind of continuities, right? But it seems like there's something about our way of understanding the world and way of understanding life that requires these discontinuities, right? So if you if you don't go to the funeral, if you don't actually go through some process of mourning, then you might not ever get over the loss of a loved one.
I think we had an unfortunate but natural experiment with the pandemic where suddenly we couldn't gather for all the rituals that we'd been gathering for. So in the US, Thanksgiving, but also weddings and funerals can't get together in person. And you could imagine there's many ways a culture could react. And one is, you know what, it was a pain to do Thanksgiving anyway. Let's not do it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Or a wedding, it's not a big deal. Let's just get a certificate online and we're all good. And that is not how cultures reacted. They said, how can we do Thanksgiving online and have it be as close as possible as to the real Thanksgiving? Or people said, how can we get married online? And then we'll have the real ceremony after this pandemic is over. And those things really show you that as silly as some of our rituals seem, we're pretty committed to them, actually. And we really want to keep them in place because, as you said, they are performing a really important role in our lives. I mean, funerals gather us together with everyone who loved that person, which has maybe never happened before. Truly, we've never gathered in this way before, to honor that person and try to help us start the process of grief and have social support. If you don't have a funeral, you're just on your own. You go home and you're by yourself in your house. If you have a funeral, there's food after. We have all of these things in place as humans to help us through these really difficult transitions that we have to make. And a lot of them are centered on some kind of ritual.
Now you talk about relationships and how, relationships develop their own rituals, although not always, right? And I think you said there's a high degree of correlation between the success of a relationship and the extent to which ritual is used. And I think you said 10% of the people you surveyed, they couldn't recall any rituals. I mean, is that when you start calling the divorce lawyer, when there's when the rituals are gone?
There's an even sadder group. So when we ask couples if they have any rituals, it varies from survey to survey, of course, but 2/3 to 3/4 typically say, yes, we do. And they're these very cute, I don't know why this is my favorite, but this one couple said, every time before we eat, we clink our silverware together. Mm-hmm. And it's just the tiniest little adorable thing, that this couple does. Most couples have something like that. As you said, that, and they agree, so if we separate them into different rooms and have independent interviews and we say, hey, is there anything you do with your spouse that's kind of special? And you make sure to do it every so often, every day, every week, every month. Most often, both people say yes, and they say the same thing. We clink our silverware together. Then there's a group that you noted that they both say nope, and they agree as well. But the saddest group is the one where one person says yes, like, oh, God, we do this thing every night where we kiss 3 times and it's adorable. And the other person says, no, we don't do anything like that. And those couples, they're not worse off than couples where they both agree they don't have one, but they're not better off either. Meaning you can't just have one of you invested in the ritual and get some benefit from it. It is this thing where we both have to endorse it. And then, as you said, we see it's actually highly correlated with things like relationship satisfaction and relationship commitment.
Well, what I found interesting is that the same action can be perceived as a ritual by one person and a routine by the other. And, this made me think about, hedonic adaptation, right? So, hedonic adaptation says, you do the same thing over and over again and it loses its vigor. It loses its magic. It just becomes, boring. But, the nature of ritual is that it's repetitive. Yeah. And so, how do we reconcile that? I mean, is there something about if you can convert it into a ritual, then it kind of re-enchants the monotony? I mean, it like, makes this thing fresh every single time. I mean, I love I also, I mean, food takes up a big place in the book. We have a lot of
Yeah.
rituals around food. I cook every night. I mean, it's my ritual. I have to cook, and I have to cook for other people. And the idea when I find out that somebody ordered, Uber Eats, or
It's
I
offensive.
get very upset.
Right.
And if someone suspects me of having, bought a prefabricated dinner, I would be insulted and get very, very upset because they
Yep.
are discounting the effort I put in. But you contrast like Soylent with like Burgundy, right? And Soylent is designed to be a routine, whereas you think about Burgundy, it's like every sip is something fresh. At least if
Yep.
you are the kind of person who values it and pays attention to it. So is ritual, if we can we endogenously create enchantment in the monotony of everyday life?
I think that partly what's happening. So with things like habituation, it's kind of the outcome measures would be things like enjoyment or happiness or things like that. And rituals can produce those emotions for sure. But one of the things that they produce, which we talked about, is meaning.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not clear that when you do things repeatedly, the meaning goes away. In fact, even just intuitively, you can think, no, wait a minute, actually, maybe the more you do something, the more meaningful it becomes.
Mm-hmm.
When you're cooking dinner every night, if you do it once, could be a fluke. If you do it 365 days in a row, that's something that's really meaningful to you. And when they don't agree, you're mad at them because you've shown how important and meaningful this is to you. So you're not getting tired of doing the cooking because the repetition of the cooking is reinforcing this thing that's very important to you. If you cook the same meal every night and serve it to them, they are going to get tired of it. They will habituate to the whatever it is that you're making. So habituation happens for sure. That's in us. But I do think ritual doesn't tap into the same exact process where, in fact, I think the repetition, and if you think about, not just cooking or something, but when you're doing a religious practice, you're not only doing it yourself repeatedly every Saturday, every Sunday, but it reminds you of your parents. It reminds you of your grandparents who might be no longer with you. And for some faiths, it's been happening for thousands of years. I mean, it connects you in a way to this incredible history that otherwise is very hard to feel connected to. And so if you think of the meaning of engaging in the same exact behavior over and over again, you might get tired of, I'm Catholic, so you might get tired of kneeling and standing and things like that. Or you can say, every time I do that, it reinforces the fact that this is meaningful, connects me to my family, and connects me to my history. And it's otherwise those emotions can be hard to surface for us. I think rituals are one of the things that give us that.
Yeah, you talked about how when you were a kid and you had to go to church, you got bored with all the monotony and the repetition. And so, I mean, is that kind of a I don't know, a skill, the what you call conceptual consumption? I mean, is there can you train yourself to be more conscious of the meaning that might be embedded in these repetitive behaviors?
One of the things that, and often when this has happened with you already, you've already kind of surfaced some of the rituals that you have in your life. We just talked about your cooking ritual, for example, which you were aware of. Obviously, it's not like, oh my God, I didn't know I was cooking. Of course, you knew you were cooking. But sometimes when we talk about things in this context, they start to feel a little bit different. Like, you know what? That actually is a ritual for me. It is something that I make sure to do regularly. So part of what I encourage people to do is it sounds a little bit too mundane, but it's like take a ritual inventory.
Mm-hmm.
Look where they're already happening in your life, because they are. For almost everyone, there's some domain of life where you're doing something like this. And just noticing them and owning them, I think, is valuable in and of itself. Every time we clink our silverware together, it's not just clinking our silverware together. We're saying, oh, we're doing our thing. This is our thing that we do. Let's do it right now. And that actually adds to the meaning of it and the gravitas of it, in a sense, because we know we've been doing it for 10 years and we're going to do it for the next 20 years also.
Yeah, but I think you're saying not just observe, but also maybe even take action to create rituals, right? Or maybe shape them, sculpt them, refine them, take things that are kind of, I don't know, ritual adjacent and maybe, make them more ritualistic.
I think it's context dependent. So I do think experimenting for sure with ritual and seeing what it does for you. They're very low cost. It's 30 seconds of doing something, you can see what it does for you. But at the same time, if you think about something like a performance anxiety, if you don't have performance anxiety, I wouldn't spend a lot of time coming up with a pre-performance ritual because
Right.
it's not a problem that you need to be solving.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think in your life, where are the areas that you'd like a little bit of help? Those can be places to experiment. If your family dinners are silent and everybody is just trying to get away as fast as they can, well, for you, that might be a place to try to develop something that you do as a family and see if it works and see if it takes hold. So I think the experimentation is there. I mean, people are doing it all the time in their lives without me telling them to. They're coming up with all kinds of things. So we do have the ability to come up with some that become meaningful for us. And the cost is low to try them. So why not give it a whirl and see what happens?
Now, another area where you say ritual could be helpful is in the area of self-control. And, the famous marshmallow test, right? That measures self-control. I mean, is it because ritual makes you think that the world is more dependable, reliable, that this kind of alleviates any, I don't know, hyperbolic discounting that you would get from anxiety around the future?
If you look, you mentioned the monks earlier. If you look at extreme instances of self-control in human history, very, very often they're paired with ritual. If people stand for 7 days, they're not just standing for 7 days. There's a ritual surrounding that. And we can't say, of course, that it's the ritual that's enabling them to stand for 7 days. It's a hard experiment to do, a 7-day standing thing where some people do a ritual or not. But the link is so clearly there in human history between ritual and self-control. It seems to be one of the domains where we have a very strong theory that pairing these together is going to help us out. And I think you're right. It is often this feeling of lack of control that rituals can bring back into our lives.
Right. And
one
so
of my favorite examples is many anthropologists have studied rain dances that occur across many cultures over time, and they often they emerge independently. In other words, it's not as though one culture came up with them and then it spread. It's that different cultures at different times decide that when it's not raining, we should do something on the ground together that will make it rain. And the skeptic would say, I don't think that's a good use of time because I don't think that things we do on the ground, well, maybe climate change, but things that we do on the ground aren't going to make it rain. So why would people independently come up with this? And of course, it's because, in times of drought, the uncertainty is so high. You have no idea when it's going to rain, and it means death if it doesn't rain. If you think about a case where uncertainty is driving everything, and what rain dance rituals can do is, it's not that they make it rain, but they bring us together as a group to reaffirm, number one, the fact that we are a group. So we shouldn't start hoarding water from each other. We should still be a group and share. Mm-hmm. And also, hey, we've been doing this ritual for 300 years. And the people who did it 300 years ago obviously got through it because we're here today. Yeah. So there's this proof in these, almost like a social proof in these rituals that, of course, we're going to get through it because this ritual has been over time. With funerals, people have been doing this kind of funeral for 1,000 years. And I think that it helped them get through their grief. Why don't we do it today and see if it does the same thing for us? We build them over time to really have a lot of meaning invested in them.
Now, I want to tie this work together with your other book, right? Happy Money. Because after all, you are a professor of marketing, and so you're interested in how people spend their money. And I think most people, I think people, it's fair to say that most people don't actually do careful analysis of the correlation between their subjective well-being and their spending patterns. I think most people don't even know how they spend their money. I've asked my students how many of them use accounting software, personal finance software, and very few of them actually do. So they don't even have a sense of what they're spending their money on. But if you do a careful analysis, does is there can we look at spending related to ritual? I mean, and can we look at ritual as a way of helping to spend in a better way?
I think Liz Dunn, my co-author, and I used to tell people to do like in the same way you could do a ritual inventory, I guess, that you could do a spending inventory, which literally can just be print out your credit card bill and look at it. Number one, which we don't want to do because it's painful, but also put stuff into categories. And you can make up the categories. I could give you some categories, but you can also make up your own categories.
Yeah, and if you use Quicken or QuickBooks, then you can easily create these categories.
Completely. And sometimes credit card companies come up with categories for you and show you, but it's actually more important to do it yourself because our categories are different than sometimes what credit card categories are. And when people do that, it can be very upsetting because you realize a couple of things. One is that you're wasting there's a lot of discretionary spending that isn't really doing a lot for you. That's the first thing. And the second thing is Liz and I did a lot of research with Lara Acton on giving makes you happier than spending on yourself. And it is horrifying when you look at your spending to see really how little of it was not really devoted just toward you. You have like some lunches where you treated somebody, but there aren't 50 entries for charitable giving. There's 50 entries for Starbucks. And so I do think actually that there's this sense of doing your spending every month, almost like this is a ritual every month where I'm going to see if my spending is reflecting my values, and it's going to be painful. And I'm usually going to fail because stuff comes up and, the car breaks down. It's hard to do these things because life is unpredictable. But I actually think this regular practice of doing it can help people get a little bit closer to spending in the way that they feel reflects their values. There's no value judgment from me in how you spend your money, but I at least want you to be consistent with what you think is important and try to help you get closer to that.
Yeah, you talk about this, I don't know, death inventory, Swedish thing, right? It's like a Marie Kondo type ritual where you go through your possessions. I mean, would you recommend a similar type of thing where you go through your spending? So you go through your flows instead of your stocks, right? to see, right, what brings you happiness and joy and so forth.
My colleague Ashley Willens, who studies time, generally speaking, but also how we fail to use our money to create better time for ourselves. And if you say, for example, assuming that you have some discretionary income, which I know that not everybody does, so that's kind of a separate conversation. But if you have any discretionary income, one thing that might be nice is actually to, for example, get somebody to babysit so that you and your spouse can have some time together. And people will say, I can't afford that. And for some people, of course, it's true. And for other people, when they look at how they've spent their money, they realize they spent $100 at Starbucks this week. You know what I mean? I'm exaggerating. But if you think about your discretionary spending, you can think, are these the categories that are actually going to help me spend my time in ways that will make me happy and that I value? Are there things I can cut off of the inventory and try to do something else with that money next month?
Well, one thing that's interesting about ritual is that rituals are cheap. You say that, as a couple, you tend to estimate the degree to which these exotic, fantastic, vacations are going to bring you joy. And maybe the clinking of the silverware is the thing that's going to bring you joy, and it doesn't cost anything, right?
That's right.
To clink the silverware. And
it takes a second. And yet it's very meaningful and very, as you said, indicative of the broader relationship.
Yeah. And so, And so on an ROI basis, it's good
Free.
ROI, right?
Free is good. Free. It's also good to experiment if something's free. Doesn't work, there's no cost to it either. So they have that property for sure.
Yeah. And so whether it's ritual or spending, I think you're recommending maybe some A/B testing inside your relationship, inside your organization.
We've tried, our daughter is 8 years old, and we've tried various things at dinner over time, and we've tried to institute them, and most of them have failed. And the failure is because our 8-year-old daughter is like, that's stupid. You know what I mean? They don't know. It's not like magically I'm the expert and I know how to do it. So an 8-year-old, of course not. It's still life. But the one that we landed on after a while was actually at the beginning of dinner, everyone says something that they're grateful for that day. And that one, for whatever reason, has stuck. And if you think about why we chose that one, it's because, of course, that's a value that I think and we think is really important. That if you're not a grateful person, you're not going to have a happy life, that it's so important to be grateful. But another family could think of something completely different that's not about gratitude, that reflects their value, that their family cares about. You could tell jokes. If you think humor is the most important thing, everybody tells a joke. That would be perfectly fine if that's your value. But it's a little bit hit or miss, I guess, is what I'm saying, on trying them out, seeing if they land, and if they don't, you can always revisit.
Yeah. Well, Mike, thanks so much for joining me. This is a wonderful book, a lot of fun, The Ritual Effect. And hopefully we'll bring maybe a ritual class to my business schools sometime soon. And also, don't forget,
that'd be so fun.
Happy money. All right. Talk soon.
Thanks so much. Great to chat.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.